Okay, so now we're starting officially. Good evening and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Ivory, and I'm chair of Northumberland Learning Connection. Everyone hear me okay? In the back? Good, thank you. Coburg is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. This territory has been inhabited and cared for from the beginning by Indigenous peoples and is covered by the Williams Treaties. We are all treaty people. It's really wonderful to see so many of you here tonight. This evening is made possible through a donation from the Ed and Sylvia von Heverbacke, is that right, Joanna? Thank you, Foundation. They are unable to join us in person, but we'll be watching the recording as soon as we get it to them. Thank you, Ed and Sylvia. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Mukesh Bhargava, the Chief of Staff of Northumberland Hills Hospital, and Hospital CEO Susan Walsh, who have joined us tonight. I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nicole Anderson, who comes to us from Baycrest, which is a global leader in residential living and in healthcare, research, innovation, and education to support older adults, all with a special focus on brain health and aging. You can see it up there, but I'll read it because I've got it here and I'm going to read it. Dr. Anderson holds many positions at Baycrest. She is the director of the Ben and Hilda Katz Interprofessional Research Center in Geriatric and Dementia Care, associate scientific director of the Kimmel Family Center for Brain Health and Wellness, and interim executive director of scientific and academic affairs, as well as a senior scientist at the Rotman Research Institute. Dr. Anderson is also a professor in the departments of psychology and psychiatry at University of Toronto. Dr. Anderson's topic this evening is Cognitive Impairment is Not Inevitable. After her presentation, we'll have a short break and then a Q&A session for about 15 to 20 minutes. So without further ado, I'd like to present Dr. Nicole Anderson.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see, I'll have to go down there. All right, so thanks so much for inviting me here. Can you hear me okay, even in the back? Good, excellent. So obviously the title that I have here on my slides is slightly different from what you just heard, but I really will be talking about how cognitive decline and dementia is not inevitable. That's the main focus of what I'm talking about. So what I'll talk about, first of all, I think it's very important to understand what is normal, healthy cognitive aging. And that helps normalize it for a lot of people, and people get quite inspired to be like, oh, good, I don't have to worry about that. That happens to me. So I'm going to start with that. And then I'm going to spend most of the time talking about factors that affect cognition. I'll talk a little bit about dementia, but really focus the bulk of this talk on the lifestyle factors that research has shown help to prevent cognitive decline and dementia. And then I'm going to end up with assigning you some homework to complete, if you choose to, an online cognitive assessment. And then we can talk about it tomorrow if you come to that session. I'm feeling a little bit of a crackle. I don't know what can be done about that. Let's see. And one of my children is calling me. No, somebody is. Yeah, okay. All right. First, I want to dispel the myth. You've all heard it before, that myth about aging, that it's all downhill with aging. You know that that's not true. You guys are really living examples that that's not the case. But it's also not true when it comes to our cognitive or our thinking abilities. So the truth is that some of them are affected by normal, healthy aging, but not all of them. So what does change as a part of normal, healthy aging? First of all, it becomes more difficult for us to recall more recent memories. Most older adults will complain about their short-term memory, but in fact, short-term memory doesn't change with age, because short-term memory just refers to how much information can you hold in mind, hold in consciousness, and you can hold as much information in mind now than you could when you were 20. However, the difficulty is in moving that information from consciousness into more permanent storage. That does become more difficult as we get older. So for that reason, I don't expect everybody here to remember everything that I say tonight. And so I will send a PDF to the organizers of a synopsis of this talk, and then a little bonus part that I'll be presenting tomorrow, and they can distribute that to you. It's also true that our working memory becomes a little bit worse as we get older. So working memory is a form of short-term memory. We're holding information in mind, but we're not doing it passively. We're working with the information. And so a great example of that is mental arithmetic. If I were to give you 2 3-digit numbers to add up, you would not only have to remember what those 2 3-digit numbers were, but what the sum of the ones column was, how much you carried over, et cetera, et cetera. And because you're working with it like that, and that does change as a part of healthy aging, you probably would find something like that a bit more difficult now than when you were younger. But that's perfectly normal. Our speed of thinking slows a bit as we age. And this is because the rate at which our brains transmit information from one area to another, you've had a lot of intense brain talks so far and more to come, so this is happening through our white matter. Our white matter disintegrates a little bit as we get older, and so the rate at which information is transmitted slows down a bit as we age. So you might just find that it takes you a bit longer to think things through now than, again, when you were younger. But again, still normal, healthy aging. Word finding problems are probably one of the top complaints among older adults, that annoying tip of the tongue phenomena, where you know that word that you want to use or that person's name, but you just can't get access to it on demand. Not really a memory problem. You haven't forgotten that word or that person's name, but just more of a retrieval problem. But again, totally normal and nothing to worry about. So whereas all of those things do change as a part of normal healthy aging, other cognitive abilities don't change as we age, or they do keep changing by getting better with time. And these include our recall of old memories. So as long as you're aging healthfully, things that you laid down a long time ago are here with you to stay, and they're not going anywhere. And so a comparison of these top 2 points relates to a comment I get all the time from people, which is, how come I can remember my wedding like it was yesterday, but I can't remember what I had for breakfast? And the reason that that happens is that's because that's how our memories age. We hold on to the older stuff quite well, but we have more difficulty storing new information. But when I hear a comment like that, I also like to remind people that one thing we know for sure about memory and aging, or memory in general, is that we remember the more important, more emotionally salient events far more easily than we remember more mundane, everyday events. And so I'm sure not too many people remember what they had for breakfast on the day of their wedding. I certainly don't. And so when you're trying to judge how does your memory hold up for recent events versus more remote events, be sure to compare apples to apples, so equally important events. As I've already mentioned, that our short-term memory does not change with age. Also, our procedural memory does not change with healthy aging. So procedural memory is remembering how to do things. So how to button up your blouse, how to ride a bike. There's truth to the statement, you never forget how to ride a bike. And so anything that's just a memory for how to do things, that stays intact with healthy aging. Our cognitive skills are maintained as we age. So any area in which you're a cognitive expert, as long as you keep working on it, you're going to keep getting better and better and better at it. And so it doesn't decline with age, but keeps improving with practice as we get older. And finally, our knowledge and our verbal abilities keep improving as we age. So this is more semantic memory, a different memory system. So we keep acquiring new knowledge about the world and keep improving our vocabulary and our fluency with the language as we age. And so if I were to give you guys a vocabulary test and then give it to university students on Monday, you guys would blow them away by a mile for sure. Because they just haven't had the years of experience with the language yet that you have. But they will catch up eventually. So this is a somewhat older study looking at the fate of different cognitive abilities across adulthood. So in the study, they looked from 20 to 80. And the blue and gray and green lines that are declining with age are what I talked about before. So it's our speed of processing, or just how fast we can think. It's our working memory, so working with information we're holding in mind. And it's our ability to form new long-term memory, so memory for recent events. By contrast, the red and orange lines that are going in the other direction is knowledge. It's semantic memory, essentially. Our simple vocabulary, and then a little bit more sophisticated vocabulary, like being able to come up with synonyms and antonyms quickly. And I really like this slide because it shows two things. One, it shows that it's not all downhill with age. It depends on what kind of cognitive ability we're talking about. But also because it highlights a very, very important point about cognitive aging, which is that it doesn't start when we hit 65. But in fact, our speed of processing, our working memory, and our ability to form new long-term memories, we're at our peak when we're in our 20s, and it slowly starts declining from there. So we've all been cognitively aging for a long time now. It's really nothing new, and it's nothing to worry about now because we didn't worry about it when we were 30. Now this study had about 50 people per decade. The total sample size was 345. And so with my postdoctoral fellow, we thought, well, let's see what happens in a larger sample. And so this is my former postdoctoral fellow, Annalise LaPlume. She really capitalized on the data in the cognitive assessment that I'm going to ask you to take. And so she took data from nearly 60,000 people who have taken this assessment, ages 18 to 89. And she looked both at the total score and at the score on each of the subtests. So the total score includes all 4 subtests. There's a long-term associative memory. Now, by long-term, it means as soon as it's out of consciousness, if you're remembering it, you're remembering it from long-term memory. It might be fairly recent, but it's still long-term memory for what happened 20 minutes ago works exactly like long-term memory for what happened 20 years ago. And so as a face name task, people saw different faces and names, and later on they saw the face and were asked, is this Joan, for example. There was a working memory task that's very much like the game Concentration, where you turn over 2 tiles, and if they match, great. Otherwise, you got to turn them back until you find all the matching pairs. There's like a connect the dots task that gets at attention switching, where you're not just going 1, 2, 3, 4, but you're going 1A, 2B, 3C. So you're switching back and forth between numbers and letters. And then there was what we call a Stroop task. It's a test of our ability to inhibit irrelevant information. So people would see like 1, 1 printed on the screen and had to respond 2 because there are 2 numbers on the screen. So you're having to inhibit what the word actually says to respond correctly to how many words there were. And so she took this total score, and I don't remember why we decided to make it so that higher scores represent worse performance. That was probably the dumbest thing I've done recently, but we did. And this is what she found. We called the paper When I'm 64, and then there was a subtitle after it, is that these, what we call fluid abilities, so episodic memory and executive functioning combined together, they are at their peak when people are young, 18, slowly start declining from there. So remember, up is worse. And then in the early 60s, then the decline becomes more steep after that. So unlike the other slide that I just showed you where it was a linear decline from 20 to 80, it looks more like it's gradual until our early 60s and then accelerates a little bit after that. Now, that was true as well on 3 of the 4 tests. So if I were to show the data for the face name test, for the working memory test, or for the attention switching test, they all followed exactly that same pattern. Slow decline up until early 60s, followed by more rapid decline. We did not find that, though, for the inhibition test. And I think that it was just the format that they were forced to use. Normally, it's done like this, where you have to say the color of the ink and not read the word as fast as you can. And so you'd say red, green, and you would do a whole page of these things. And that definitely reliably shows age-related decline. And it's just not as potent in the version that was used, or is used, in the cognicity assessment. So how does this play out in everyday life? How are these kinds of changes that happen with normal, healthy aging, how do they influence our day-to-day behaviors, and what kind of cognitive slips are normal, and what kind of cognitive slips are not so normal? So first of all, it's normal, as I said, to forget acquaintances' names from time to time. You go to introduce one acquaintance to another, and you blank on one of their names. It's terribly embarrassing, but it's really nothing to worry about. But it's not normal to forget the name of a close loved one, like your spouse's name. It's perfectly normal to get lost in an unfamiliar place. So if you were to visit a mall that you haven't been to before, you might get turned around and forget what door you came in, or where you parked the car in a large parking lot. Nothing to worry about. But it's not normal to get disoriented in a place that you used to be really familiar with and know like the back of your hand. It's normal to forget to buy an item or two from the store. Happens all the time for me. But it's not normal to get home and forget that you had just been at the store shopping. It's normal to miss some of the details when you're telling a story. So if you're to go home tonight and tell somebody in your neighborhood about this talk, again, you will not remember all of the details, and that's perfectly normal. But it's not normal to not even be able to tell the story because you've forgotten the main gist of it, that this was a talk about memory and aging. It's perfectly normal to not immediately know the correct date. If you're off by a day or two, I don't get concerned about that. But it's not normal to be completely disoriented in time and thinking it's a different era entirely. And finally, it's perfectly normal to tell the same story or the same joke on different occasions. You forget who you told that fantastic joke to and you start telling it to them again. But it's not normal to keep telling the same story or joke over and over again within a single conversation. So I hope I put a lot of people's minds at ease, because very often people come up to me and say, well, I do this, do I have to worry about it? And 99% of the time it's things like this. And no, you don't have to worry about those things at all. If you come tomorrow, I'm going to start out the session by talking about memory strategies that will help minimize the frequency of these kinds of things. However, over here on the right, this is really a pretty accurate depiction of what it's like to live with dementia. And so we're going to very briefly talk about that before we start talking about how do we prevent that. So a lot of people will ask me, what is the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease? So I want to start with that. Dementia, the definition is that it's cognitive decline that's severe enough to disrupt everyday functioning. So dementia is really a symptom of a disease. And of all the diseases that cause dementia, Alzheimer's is the most common disease that causes dementia. But there are many other kinds of brain diseases that can cause dementia as well. I am not going to go into them, that's why I kept them short as abbreviations. I do want to highlight one of them, though, which is vascular dementia, which is the result of either a big stroke or the mini strokes that you've heard about before, the TIAs. Now, about a quarter of us in this room will have at least one TIA in our lifetime, which is somewhat scary, but not really, because they've also in the past been called silent strokes, meaning that they're clinically silent. They don't leave any kind of consequences or cognitive decline. But the problem lies when people have too many of them, that over time their effects gradually accumulate and cause cognitive impairment that looks an awful lot like Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, it's very rare to find people who only have Alzheimer's disease or only have vascular dementia. It's much more common to have mixed pathology. Now, the prevalence of dementia in Canada is on the rise. We all know this. This is just due to population aging. So currently, we're at about 650,000 Canadians living with dementia. We're going to hit nearly 1 million by 2030, which is not too far away. And it's going to really just escalate from there. This will happen for a while, but then it should start to decline again as my generation, Gen X, comes through, because there's just fewer of us, right? And also, the good news is that although the prevalence of dementia is on the rise, the number of people living with dementia is on the rise, the incidence, which is the likelihood that any one person will get it, is actually on the decline in the Western world. And this is because we're getting much better at treating other conditions that put us at risk of dementia, like hypertension, diabetes, things like that. So 1 out of every 11 Canadians over the age of 65 has some form of dementia, and 1 out of 3 Canadians over the age of 85 has some form of dementia currently in Canada, or at least in 2016. Now, that's the end of the depressing part, because I like to remind people that whenever you see stats like this, you can flip them on their head, right? So let's do that. Let's flip these numbers and find out what's the prevalence of good brain health in Canada. And that is 10 out of every 11 Canadians over the age of 65 does not have any form of dementia and is living in good brain health. And 2 out of every 3 people over the age of 85 is living in good brain health. And so the bulk of the rest of this talk is all about what can you do to increase your chances of staying in that 10 out of 11 or 2 out of 3. One more slide before I get there, though, just to be complete, and that is the dementia risk factors that are out of our control. And the first one is age, just the simple fact that the older we are, the more likely we are to develop dementia. The second one is genetics. Almost all forms of dementia have a genetic contribution to them, meaning that if you have a first-degree relative, a parent or a sibling with dementia, then your risk is higher than somebody without a family history. But it does not mean that you're going to get it. And the way that I view it is that your genetics might increase your risk a bit, but like a teeter-totter, you can do all these other things to help push that risk back down. And finally, we're learning more and more about sex differences in dementia risk. So for every 3 people with Alzheimer's disease, 2 of them are women. And this seems to hold up even if we take into account differences in longevity between men and women. But other forms of dementia, like dementia due to Parkinson's disease, that affects more men than women. And we don't yet really understand why there are these sex differences. It gets more complicated than that. It looks like not only are there sex differences in the risk of getting any one form of dementia, but there's sex differences in the risk factors for, you know, like what consists of a risk factor for this form of dementia differs between men and women. The more we learn about this, the more we're going to get to the state of precision aging, so that we can say, okay, well, you're male, you have this family history, therefore this is how we should try to prevent it and treat it. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting closer to that. So we can't do anything about these things, right? We can't do anything about getting older, or about who our parents were, or about what our biological sex was at birth. But we can do all sorts of other things. And for whatever reason, I picture the Michelin Man, like we're building up protective padding to help reduce our risk of developing dementia. So what are these things that we can do something about? I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on this slide. This was a very influential paper, the Lancet Commission, that came out in 2020, stating that at least 40% of dementia cases in the world can be attributable to 12 modifiable lifestyle factors. The first one is education. People who have more years of formal education are much less likely to develop dementia than people with lower levels of education. Why is this? Well, education helps us to build a richer neural network. Education leads generally to more complex occupations, and people who engage in more complex occupations where you have to think a lot and deal with people a lot are less likely to develop dementia. And it usually leads to higher paying jobs, which gives you the money to afford the gym membership and the healthy food and stuff like that. So it's not that sitting in class when we're in grade 8 directly leads to a lower risk of dementia, but it's more all these other knock-on effects of high education. Hearing loss accounts for 8% of dementia cases worldwide. And people often are surprised by this. There's a number of things that hearing loss does. We saw a bit of it tonight, that people start to withdraw socially because they can't hear in noisy settings. But also, when you have hearing loss, your brain is working on overdrive all the time, trying to figure out what's being said so that you can deal with the information. And, you know, that just wears the brain out, to put it in very simplistic terms. So it's really important to try to get the best hearing aids that you possibly can to try to offset those effects. People who have had a traumatic brain injury have an elevated risk of dementia, and the more severe the brain injury, the bigger the risk. And this is because if you think about all the things that we're trying to do to make our brains as robust as possible, the head injury just knocks some of that off, right? So it provides, you have less cognitive reserve, as we call it. Metabolic disorders such as hypertension, obesity, smoking, which causes lung and heart issues, and diabetes collectively all contribute to dementia risk. Excessive alcohol use is another one and can lead to its own form of dementia called Korsakoff's dementia. Depression increases risk for dementia, especially late life depression. And part of what's going on there is that people who are depressed have elevated levels of cortisol, and cortisol is toxic to the hippocampus in particular, which is the area mostly responsible for storing new memories. Being socially isolated increases the risk. So lonely people, there's something that came out a couple years ago, loneliness increases risk of mortality significantly, but also dementia risk. Physical inactivity is another big one. So there's a ton of research about the power of exercise to maintain cognitive functioning and reduce dementia risk. When we're exercising, it's doing all sorts of good things for us. Obviously, it's good for the heart, and whatever is good for the heart is good for the brain. Our brain has a ton of blood vessels in it, too. So by keeping a good cardiovascular system, we're also keeping our brain in good cardiovascular health as well. And when we're exercising, we're increasing levels of what's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which leads to the birth of new neurons in the brain as well. And that happens, it can happen through cognitive thinking as well, but it really happens the most when we're exercising aerobically. And then living around air pollution has also been identified as something that can elevate dementia risk. So you guys should be pretty good out here. Toronto, I'm in trouble. So what this is saying, this model is not only do various factors contribute to 40% of dementia cases worldwide, that if they were addressed, we could eliminate 40% of dementia cases, but also that dementia risk is a life course phenomena, that there are risk factors in early life. There's probably risk factors in utero too, like if our mother smoked, to midlife, to late life. It's not just something that we should address in late life, but we should be addressing it at all stages of our lives. But I argue that more research is needed linking the specific risk factors to life periods. So you'll see here, obviously they put education in early life because that's when we tend to gain formal education. But I don't think there was a whole lot of rhyme or reason to why they put hearing loss in midlife or smoking in late life. They did it based on where was the evidence so far. So if a paper studied hearing loss in midlife and looked at later dementia risk, okay, let's put it in midlife. But that doesn't mean it's not important in late life. So anyway, I'm going to come back to this later. So I want to come back to this now and ask, is it really true when I'm 64? This was the results of what's called segmented regression. It just looks at, is the function linear? And then you add in one inflection point. Does that improve the model fit? You add in 2 inflection points. Does that improve the model even more? And we found that one inflection point explained the data the best. But these are the raw data. So every dot is an individual. You'll see we're missing age 80 or 79. That's because the test, when it was initially released, It would only give people results up to age 80, I think. And so we think a lot of people lied about how old they were if they were over 80, because there was just a ton of data from, yes, I'm 80. So we just got rid of all of that data. But what I really want to impress on you here, both the scale is about 4 times bigger, actually, from 2 to -2 here. But just the variability also follows the same pattern. So inter-individual variability, or how different people are, that slowly starts increasing up to about 64, and then really starts increasing after that. So what accounts for the fact that some people in their later years have a lot of cognitive decline, but other people are functioning as well as people much younger than them? And so what Annalise did in another paper is look at, well, what data do we have with the Cognicity data set? And she had 8 of the Lancet Commission's 12 risk factors, just from people fill out a little questionnaire before they do the cognitive assessment. So she had education, hypertension, hearing loss, traumatic brain injury, substance abuse. We didn't have just drinking, it was combined in the questionnaire, drinking or other drugs, diabetes, smoking, and depression. And so she looked at how do these risk factors contribute to somebody's level of cognitive functioning and that trajectory. And this is kind of a complicated slide, but just looking at how many of these 8 risk factors people had from 0 to 5, we found that it affects cognition a lot more strongly than age itself. So for example, if you look at the 2 kind of oranger lines here, what we found is that somebody who's in their 20s with 3 dementia risk factors had cognition on par with somebody in their 40s. So in other words, 3 risk factors aged them cognitively by 20 years. Somebody in their 50s with 4 risk factors had cognition comparable to somebody in their 60s. So it's aging people by 10 years. Somebody in their 60s with 5 risk factors, now they're like 10 years older. Oh, sorry. Yeah, 10 years older. So really it's, whereas the rate of cognitive change is again gradual and then more significant, that's true. That's more true with people with low risk factors. You start piling on risk factors and cognitive aging happens a lot quicker. She also looked at sex differences, and we only found sex differences on the face name task. And what she found was that women do better than men. We know this. Our verbal memory and our verbal abilities are better. Sorry, guys. Your fine motor skills are better than us. But she also found greater age-related decline, cognitive decline in men among those with 0 or 1 risk factor, but not those with 2 or more risk factors. In other words, women do better than men, but as soon as we have multiple risk factors, we're not doing better than men. So risk factors are eliminating that sex difference. That gives women an advantage in verbal memory. So basically, multiple risk factors evens the playing field. And then finally, more recently, another student worked with me to figure out what's so special, what makes these people special who are here in their 80s that are performing as well as people a lot younger than them. So this is a concept called super agers. And so he looked at what makes some of these people super agers. And so what he did, the definition kind of that's accepted in the field of a superager is somebody in their 80s whose memory is as good as people in their 50s or 60s. And so it's comparing the roughly people who are in the red circle to the yellow square. And what he found was that intact hearing predicted superager status in women, but not in men. And women were more likely to be superagers than men were on average. So 39% of women versus 26% of women, but only when we compared women and men to everybody in the yellow box. When we instead compared women in the red circle to women in the yellow box, that sex difference went away. In other words, we need to account for the fact that women tend to outperform men. And so if we're looking at what makes somebody a superager, we need to compare women to women and men to men. And then finally, I'm coming back now to when are these risk factors important? And I think what we need to start with is when are these risk factors prevalent? And it doesn't map on to the Lancet model very well. So this is Annalise's, her 8 risk factors. And you can see that although low education is listed as an early life risk factor, older adults are more likely to have lower education just because of cohort effects. Being born during the war, for example, or immigration interrupting education. Sorry, I can see better on my screen. Hearing loss, they put it in midlife, but obviously it becomes more prevalent as we get older. Substance abuse, they put alcohol use in midlife, but young people are more likely to abuse substances than older people are. So I think our models, as we move forward, we need to account for when are people engaging in these kinds of risk factors, and try to eliminate it when it's more likely to occur. So if from a public health perspective, I think we should go after substance abuse in young people, because it could have profound effects on their dementia risk later in life, for example. So now I'm going to get into individual other things that we can do something about. So we're learning more and more about the relationship between what we eat and dementia risk. And by and large, I'd say this is the Canada Food Guide. It is a brain health food pattern. So we created the Brain Health Food Guide as part of the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging. So this was done with nutrition scientist colleagues, looking at all of the evidence that we have from studies that have been randomized controlled trials, getting people to eat in a healthy way and looking at the benefits of that for cognition. And the Brain Health Food Guide gets it right. It really is, the Canada Food Guide really gets it right. So we really should be eating half a plate of vegetables and fruit for all those great antioxidants. Our sources of protein should come from lean sources of protein and from meat alternatives. And then we should be eating a quarter of whole grains. Quarter of what we eat should be whole grains, which contribute to good gut health. And we're learning more and more about the relationship between gut health and brain health. They are directly connected to each other. So the only distinction between the Canada Food Guide and the Brain Health Food Guide is focusing on a few key foods within this. So among the fruits, berries should be a big proportion. Among the veggies, leafy greens and cruciferous veggies, so Brussels sprouts and broccoli and things like that. And walnuts and fatty fish should also be emphasized in a Brain Health Food Guide. So we are just about to launch the LEAD study, the Lifestyle, Exercise, and Diet Study. We started this study right before COVID in person, and then COVID happened. We had to shut it down. So we decided, well, let's make it virtual, and then we can avoid any issue. And so we're going to be recruiting people from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec, who will be randomized to an exercise program, a diet program, both or neither. And we're going to look at what the benefits are of that on cognition over time, and then how are those mediated by changes in the gut microbiome. So we know that if we get you to eat a healthy diet, in 2 weeks your microbiome will be improved and healthier. And exercise also has beneficial effects, but these things have not been linked up before, that start exercising, eating well, your gut improves and your cognition improves. So it'll be the first time to put it all together. Exercise your brain. Thinking is literally a workout for the brain. So when you're thinking hard, it's increasing blood flow to the areas that are working. It's increasing metabolism, just like when we're working out our muscles, it's increasing metabolism. It fosters new connections or synaptogenesis between brain areas. It fosters neurogenesis, as I said, so the birth of new neurons. And older adults who are cognitively active have about a 2.5 times lower risk of developing dementia than older adults who are cognitively sedentary. So give yourselves all a round of applause for coming out in this lecture series and learning more. So a lot of people will ask me, well, what should I do to stay cognitively active? And the good news is you can do whatever you want. I'm not going to tell you to do crossword puzzles if you hate them. You can do anything that you find reasonably complex. If you're already a super expert at it, then you're not really working out if you can do it in your sleep. Find things that are interesting to you so you keep them up. But also try to vary your cognitive activity throughout the week or the month or something like that. Because although our brains are always, the whole brain is involved in everything that we do, there is some specialization to it. So try to do some verbal activities like courses like this or book clubs or discussion groups, which are going to work out more of your left hemisphere, with more visual spatial activities like doing puzzles or going out and exploring the province, which will be more right hemisphere, with planning and organizational activities like volunteering and planning events like this, which will engage more of your frontal lobes. So try to mix up what you're doing to really get a whole brain workout. Be social. I mentioned with the Livingstone model that people who are socially isolated have a higher risk of dementia. It elevates risk. And in fact, our most socially isolated seniors have a 3 times higher risk of dementia than people who are well connected. But what this research also shows, there's an important distinction between social isolation and loneliness. So people can be socially isolated and not lonely. They can just, that could just suit their personality. And other people can be social gadflies but feel lonely, right? I know a lot of people but not really feel supported by any of them. So quality really matters more than quantity when it comes to dementia risk, to have those few close friends and confidants that you can rely on. Sleep is another factor that really influences our cognition and, in the case of sleep apnea, our risk of dementia. So, and part of what's going on here is that we are laying down our long-term memories during sleep, especially during these deeper phases of sleep. That's when we're consolidating memories. And so if your sleep is disrupted, you're disrupting that consolidation of memory. So for insomnia, try to avoid sleeping pills. Talk to your doctors, but a lot of them are benzodiazepines. And there's a ton of research that shows that when people have benzodiazepines active in their system, their memory is about 50% worse. And they tend to have a long half-life. That is, if somebody takes a sleeping pill at 10 p.m., it's still active in their system in the morning, right, Doc? That's accurate? So you might find that your memory is not as good than if you haven't taken that sleeping pill. What seems to be emerging as very effective is sleep cognitive behavioral therapy. So check that out. There's tons of books about it now, probably some apps of just how we can change our behavior to reduce symptoms of insomnia. Up to pee, generally no biggie. People often ask me that. Like, I get up many times a night, especially men with prostate issues, but usually they make it through these first few hours when you're getting that good deep sleep before they have to wake up. So I wouldn't stress it if that's going on. But treat sleep apnea for sure. So sleep apnea is when people stop breathing until their bodies wake them up and say, hey, you've got to breathe again. And people with sleep apnea can stop breathing at like 75, 100 times a night. And you're cutting, the oxygen to the brain is being cut off momentarily, but that builds up over time. And there's clear evidence that people with sleep apnea have a higher risk of dementia and cognitive decline. So if your partner tells you that you snore very heavily, maybe go for a sleep test because you might have sleep apnea. And the solution there is the CPAP machine. My brother uses a sleep PAP machine, and it changed his life. He suddenly had energy. He could think a lot more clearly. So it's big, it's noisy, it's not comfortable, but it really has brain benefits. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Okay, so come back to our Lancet case. So these 12 modifiable risk factors that account for 40% of dementia cases worldwide, they're missing a bunch. They're missing brain healthy eating, they're missing cognitive engagement. Oh, they do have social connections, but they do it in terms of isolation. Their sleep's not in there. It's also true that people who are bilingual or multilingual are less likely to develop dementia. If they get it, they're about 4.5 years later than monolinguals. And this is probably because they become executive functioning experts at switching between languages, inhibiting the one that they're not speaking in while they're focusing on the one that they are. Musicians are also less likely to develop dementia. Same kind of thing. They're bilingual in a sense of reading the printed music and translating that into something on an instrument. So there's all these other things that we know are associated with better cognition. And so I suggest that probably way more than 40% of dementia cases can be attributable to various lifestyle factors. So given all of this evidence, at Baycrest we're opening up the Kimmel Family Center for Brain Health and Wellness. So here's a rendition of it. And what it is, it's the world's first research-driven community center delivering personalized dementia risk reduction programming. So it's available to anybody who's 50 or over, who is free of dementia, because we're trying to prevent it. And we have a gym, a warm water shallow pool, a room with soft flooring for floor exercises or meditation, a room for classes or group activities, a creative arts studio, and an open concept theater. And there is a kitchen there that needs to be rebuttled and redone. So as soon as we get the money, there will be a teaching kitchen in there as well. So these are just some pictures of the center. This is when the pool was just being finished getting built, and so there's still some construction stuff there. We're getting all new gym equipment for the gym. This is the old stuff from the space before. This is the lobby or foyer, and this is one of the classrooms. And so what we're going to be doing is providing evidence-based programs for brain health, personally prescribed based on a deep dementia risk evaluation, a 4.5-hour dementia risk evaluation. And so then it's going to be grouped into buckets. So we'll be looking at, are you at risk because you're not physically active enough? Go take some classes, exercise classes. You can pick what you want to do. It could be in the gym, it could be in the pool, it could be Zumba, whatever. But get up to that 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous activity. If their diet is not up to a brain healthy eating pattern, they'll learn about the Brain Health Food Guide, learn how to read labels, how to shop on a budget, and then they'll apply that in whatever they want. If they want to learn about Spanish cuisine, the instruction will follow a brain healthy food guide with Spanish food. If they're not cognitively active enough, they can take a creative arts class, a language class, computer classes, whatever. If they're stressed or have mild anxiety or depression, they can take stress reduction, meditation, yoga. There's not going to be any social classes because that is hard to conceptualize, but all of the instructors will be trained to incorporate social activity into all of the other classes. And we're also thinking of requiring all new members to take a little bit of a behavior change course at the beginning, learning how to set SMART goals, so specific, measurable, actionable, I forget the other ones, what the other letters start for. And then also how to overcome barriers, you know, so if somebody, for example, Shirley doesn't drive, how can she get to the center? And get her to figure out solutions to that, to pair up with a buddy who can drive her, for example. So that's part of our plans. We'll hope to open in August. And I really believe that personalization is key. So I just had a meeting this morning with our statistician, and he's like, I like the fact that you say people can take whatever they want to fill their prescription, but what if we ask people do you want to have full choice, free range, or are you willing to be randomized? And I was like, no. If I tell somebody just through randomization, which is the typical scientific way to do things, that you have to go to a sewing class and you have to swim. Well, what if you hate sewing and you hate swimming? People aren't going to keep it up. And I also don't believe that it has to be any one thing. Like, people have to be physically active. How they get there doesn't matter probably. So I think it's really important that people pick what they like to do to fill that prescription. Okay, your homework. So if you choose to do this, I encourage you to take Cogniciti's brain health assessment. So the website is cognicity.com, and you'll land on a page like this. You'll register, filling in, making an account. And then when you get in there, you'll see take the assessment, this little green bar up there. And you'll start out by filling out questionnaires about demographic information, and also these kinds of conditions that can influence cognition that we talked about before, and plus some extra ones. And then you'll take the 4 tests. Takes about 20 minutes. So this is that concentration game where you turn over tiles until you find matching pairs. This is that inhibition test that frankly doesn't work very well, so don't worry about it. This is the face name test for associative memory. And here's the connect the dots test with switching. So 1A, 2B, 3C, so on. Then you'll get your score, which is a percentile score. So it's telling you relative to your age, where do you fall? And so 77 means that you're doing as well or better than 77% of the population. The normal range is pretty generous. It's the 7th percentile up to the 100th percentile. So very few people actually fall in the impaired range. And even if you do, I believe that it tells you don't sweat it. It could be that you were stressed out or anxious, or maybe you didn't have a good sleep the night before. Come back and take it again before you start worrying about it. There's also a smart tracker, which I helped to develop that part of it, where you do just some questionnaires about your lifestyle, about your level of physical activity, your eating habits, things like that. And it tells you, how are you doing in your everyday life to help address your risk factors. So that's under this little Smart Tracker tab here. So it's a 5-minute questionnaire asking about your diet, your cognitive engagement, social engagement, sleep quality, emotional well-being, and physical well-being or activity. And very, very brief. And then you get results about how are you doing relative to where you should be at. And so for this fake example, this person's doing just fine, except maybe wants to try to be more socially engaged than they are. And people can come back to the Smart Tracker over time and see how they're improving. And finally, Cognicity. I'm not connected to Cognicity, but people can choose to be part of the Brain Health Registry if they want to, which means that people can contact them, researchers can contact them to be part of research studies if people sign up for that. So your homework is to go to www.cognicity.com. It only works on regular computers, laptops, and desktops, unfortunately. They are working on a tablet-compatible version of it, but they're not there yet. So you'd have to do it on a regular computer. So our plans for tomorrow morning, I've actually revised this in the train over here. I think I'm going to start out with 30 minutes about memory strategies, practical everyday memory strategies. Then I picture there being stations in here. In one station, I'll be sitting there, and if you want to review your results from the brain health assessment with me and be told how to interpret it, I'd be happy to do that, or answer any other questions that you might have. I brought some neuropsychological tests with me so you can play with them, including the Stroop task of naming the color of the ink when the word is a different color. It's a lot of fun. We developed a year-long educational program during COVID with 7 domains of dementia risk. Each each module has about 24 episodes in it. It got professionally narrated by the Canadian actor Jean Marchand in English and in French. And so I brought one of the episodes with me for you to play and listen to. And then, like I said, answer any other questions you may have. So that's the plans for tomorrow. And then I take the train ride home, and then I get on a plane to go to Cuba. Yeah. So I just want to thank my funding agencies and also the very, very important, fabulous donors that help to fund, like the Kimmel Center. So, thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for a fascinating. I can't tell you how much I learned. Normally we would break for coffee, but we're 165 people or 70 people in here, and I think we want to ask questions. So why don't we put that off until we're on the way out? It'll save time because we won't be breaking up and trying to find our seats again. So we're going to go right to questions, and Nedra, who is coming up here, trying to find her way up, is going to have the mic. And she'll walk over and hand it to someone who wants to ask a question. You don't need to get up from your seat. Stay there. We'll bring the mic to you. Okay? So hands up, people. Let's go. Okay, Susan.
I'm wondering if you could comment on some of the games that came out many years ago, Luminosity. Does practice make perfect in terms of your cognitive health?
Yes, good question. Practice makes perfect on that test. So you keep doing it, you're going to keep getting better and better at it, but it doesn't really generalize to other cognitive functions. So what I say to people is that if you like that kind of thing, like I play backgammon on my phone ad nauseum because I enjoy it, and I'm getting better at it, but I don't expect it to have any influence on other aspects of my life. So it can be a fun way to stay cognitively engaged, but their sales claims are not well supported by the science.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Yes, thank you very much. I read a paper that they were saying that balance exercises are as good as aerobic exercises.
Yeah, it's interesting that the literature is starting to shift a little bit from before it was all aerobic. But what's interesting is what that aerobic activity was in the research, linking it to better cognition, bigger brains in older adults. It was always walking. So as long as you're walking fast enough that your breathing is up and your heart is pumping, that's sufficiently aerobic. Anyway, that was the focus of all the research in the 90s. Now it's kind of moving towards finding that strength training, which balance gets into a little bit, as being really beneficial for cognition. So I know I have one of those balance boards at home, and you're working out your muscles, so try to stay up on that. But it's also just generally important. Balance training and stretching are very important just to maintain our functional ability as we get older, to be able to stay living independently, grab that casserole dish off the shelf, and not fall, too. So definitely try to get aerobic for the heart health benefits, muscle strength training, and balance for functional activity and stretching, those four. Yeah.
Does declining visual health, such that the person with the declining visual health also has to engage more actively in surroundings, does that affect?
Yes, it does. And I should have added that didn't make it into the Lancet Commission either. But there's growing evidence that visual impairment has about a similar, maybe not quite as strong as hearing impairment, influence on cognition, and even worse is dual sensory loss, people who are hard of hearing and vision problems. I don't know about you guys who has progressives in the room. They're a nightmare, aren't they? Like going downstairs, I just can't get it right. I can't see where I'm going, and so it makes me tentative, and that influences my confidence in engaging with the world. So it definitely has its impact, because I'm thinking, even at the train station, I went to get on the escalator. It was going so fast, I was like, no, I'm not confident here, so I took the stairs, but this is probably better for me. But yeah.
That sort of leads to my question, where the various risk factors, you talk about treatment, and how much does treatment mitigate that risk factor? And does it depend on the age at which the risk factor occurred and the duration of the treatment?
Right, so that's a great question. So most of these things, we know that if they're treated, cognition will benefit. And I don't think it really matters when it occurs and when they're treated. So let's take, for example, depression and anxiety. When they're treated, people's cognition improves and their hippocampal functioning improves to some extent, and the risk of dementia goes down. If people are not exercising enough, that can be started at any age to start having beneficial effects. So I think getting at the right answer is that addressing any of these risk factors will have beneficial effects, and it really doesn't. Of course, it'd be best if we, from birth, live the perfect healthy lifestyle, but nobody does that. So it's just more important to address these things when they're identified and when people want to address them at any stage in life.
I just was surprised not to see arthritis down there as a risk factor, because it affects so much of, if one is suffering from arthritis, so much of your abilities to exercise, to get out there and be social, and all of that stuff. And I'm wondering if you've thought of that to sort of look at.
Yeah, more from the treatment perspective, there's a little bit of evidence that anti-inflammatories, people who have lifelong anti-inflammatory use have a lower risk of dementia. Because a lot of these brain diseases that cause dementia have an inflammatory component to them. So if people are taking anti-inflammatories for arthritis, it can have some beneficial effects for the brain. That's not always replicated well, and maybe it's because I think one failure of research is that they look at one thing in isolation and forget everything else that's going on. So if it's a anti-inflammatory randomized controlled trial, they don't take into account, well, what are they eating in these groups? How physically active are they? Are they socially connected? And I think the good thing about the Lancet Commission is it's getting us to think about everything together all at the same time instead of just one thing at a time.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought somebody will ask this question. What about supplements, vitamins, things? We hear folic acid, ginkgo, B12.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Turmeric.
Yeah, B12. If definitely as we get older, our B12 levels start to decline. So definitely get it checked out by your doctor, because that has direct effects on cognition, and it's a pretty easy solution to that. The other ones, my nutrition scientist friends say, in general, except vitamin D here in Canada in the winter, we generally, if you have a healthy diet, you're getting all these good things. And it's more important that the interactions among all the foods that we're eating in our whole foods diets than just supplementing something that you might not even be low on in anyway. And so that's why all of these things keep failing, right? You see something in the media, today it's blueberries, tomorrow it's coffee, and the next day, and you never hear about it again, because, again, they did something in isolation, and that's not how the body works, so that we're eating a mixed diet of everything that's working together. So,
How are the risk factors affected by diseases such as Parkinson's?
yeah, so Parkinson's itself, about a third of people who get Parkinson's develop dementia. And 2/3 don't. And there's two forms. There's dementia due to Parkinson's, and then there's Lewy body dementia, which is very closely related to it. Both obviously have the motor symptoms that we're familiar with Parkinson's, and similar with Lewy bodies, but they also have the cognitive deficits. So in all of these things, part of it, the way to view it, all of these things, exercise, diet, social connections, cognitive connections, they might not be directly affecting the brain pathology behind the diseases, but they're raising somebody's level of reserve again so that people can live in good brain health despite what's going on with their disease. And a lot of this is based off of a famous study, the Nun studies, where they studied this group of nuns. Nuns are very highly educated people. They stay cognitively engaged throughout their lives. They eat pretty healthy. They don't have a bad lifestyle of too much alcohol usually, or drugs. And they live a very homogenous life, like they're all living kind of the same life. And what they found, these nuns donated their brains after death. They found that many, many of these nuns had their brain full of Alzheimer's pathology, yet they were cognitively intact when they died. So their brain was just a mess of Alzheimer's, but it didn't affect them. Why? Probably because the high education, the healthy lifestyle, continued cognitive engagement. And so that's the way that I view these things, that we might not be, education is not going to clear out the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's, but it can allow you to stay in good cognitive functioning despite the plaques and tangles that might be brewing, if that makes sense. It's a similar concept for Parkinson's. Yeah.
Oh, I'm interested, I mean, we always hear about berries and leafy greens being very important, but you didn't talk about the importance of whether or not they're organic. And does that not make a significant difference? And if so, it becomes very challenging to eat organically because berries generally are not available easily.
Yeah, and they're crazy expensive,
Yeah.
too.
And they're also not necessarily
Yeah.
fresh. And
I don't even know where this is coming
Yeah.
from, but yeah. Yeah, so my nutrition scientist colleagues, I can only say what they're saying. I don't have any training in nutrition science, is that generally organic is not nutritionally superior to regular produce. And in the case of berries in particular, they're often not available, but frozen is as good as fresh because they're flesh frozen right when they're ripe, and that's even a bit better than that they were on a truck for 3 days before they came to the supermarket. So I don't buy organic, except banana. Organic bananas taste so much better than regular bananas, so that's the only reason why I buy them. They taste better. But I don't buy other stuff organic because it's so crazy expensive.
I'm wondering about sleep. Can a person get too much sleep?
I think the answer to that is not at night, but they can. Napping too much during the day is not a great recipe for sleeping well at night. So a lot of older adults who have problems sleeping at night nap during the day. So trying to get them to get rid of those naps will help them sleep better at night. Yeah.
Can I ask a question also related to sleep? People are hearing about the use of cannabis as a sleep enhancer, CBD, whatever the THC combinations and so on.
Yeah.
Anything to tell us about that?
Not really, because it's kind of too new for it to be legal for us to understand the long-term consequences. And especially in an aging context, I don't know if the research is there. I honestly don't know if it's out yet. Yeah. And not smoking it, I would not recommend, because that's just bad for lung health. Yeah.
Excuse, again, I know I'm bothering here, but you mentioned sleep, and I read this book by Matthew Walker, I think, and he talks also about body rhythms and the idea of having a routine for your sleep, so don't mess up where you're sleeping and that sort of thing.
Yes.
And they also mentioned it's been connected with this intermittent fasting, again with the body rhythms. Could you touch on that?
Yeah, I can't really. I don't really have expertise in that at all. But the rhythm thing reminds me of circadian rhythms. So we all cycle on about a 24-hour clock as a sinusoidal function. So at one point we're at our peak, and another point we're at our trough. Where different hormones are changing, our body temperature is changing. And furthermore, where we peak changes throughout our lifetime. So infants are morning larks. They're up at 5 a.m. ready for our attention. Teenagers become night owls biologically. They're not trying to be ornery, but their bodies have changed. And then as we age, we tend to become more morning people again. So most older adults, not all of them, are at their peak in the morning. And there's a lot of strong evidence that influences how well we can think and remember as well. So on average, older adults will do much better on cognitive tests in the morning than in the afternoon. So the implications of that, just for everyday functioning, is to try to do the more complicated things that need thinking in the morning. If you're a morning person, not everybody here will be, but you know when you're at your peak. So do those things at your peak, and then save things that are not so complicated for other parts of the day. So that doesn't directly answer the question. I can't speak to intermittent fasting at all, really.
It actually be regular sleep pattern, like matching it up with the same time each time. Oh wait, I drive her crazy because I got talking. I want to get bed.
Yeah. No, and I get that, and I think that's part of the sleep cognitive behavioral therapy approach too, of treating sleep as kind of a sanctuary place where it's always the same time, the same place, the same comforts, the lights off, no blue screen. You don't do anything except sleep in that bed. So people who have insomnia, they shouldn't stay in bed just fretting about the fact that they can't sleep. They should get out of there, because otherwise you're associating being in that bed with fretting and worrying, and that can create a vicious cycle too. So, yeah.
What kind of strategies would you, or recommendations would you make for somebody who starts to see in a partner or a loved one signs of dementia? What do they do?
Yeah, so that's a good one. So I would definitely reach out to a family doctor to start with. Even that might not be successful. I've just seen over and over again people who've approached their family doctor and the doctor says, well, you're 72, what do you expect? So I hope that you can take my hand out when you get it and be like, no, I just expect these mild things. This is more than that. So you might have to be really, really insistent to have the family doctor take it seriously, and then hopefully refer on to a neurologist of some sort. Or a psychiatrist can handle it too, or a geriatrician. Because the earlier that it's detected, the sooner those doctors can look at everything else that might be influencing cognition, right? So is their B12 okay? What's their cholesterol levels? Are they depressed? And start treating those things that are only going to make it worse and go more quickly. Yeah.
Question at the back here about the role of meditation.
Yes, yeah. So there's quite a bit of evidence that meditation is associated, especially long-term meditation, with improved cognition, executive functions in particular, and also altered brain cognitivity and white matter changes as well. So quite a bit of evidence for mindfulness meditation in particular. And so some of our trials, we have one right now with lonely older adults and mindfulness meditation. We work a lot with an industry partner, Interaxon, and the Muse headsets, because that alone could be a very effective way to get people into meditative states, just having that feedback from the Muse headset. So yes, that's why we're including it in our Kimmel Center for people who are stressed, is including meditation.
I wanted to ask you, I was really interested in what you said about super agers.
Yes.
Could you?
Yeah.
Could you expand on that just a bit?
Yeah, so for about 20 years or so, people have been studying super agers. So why is it that some people can live to be 100 and be just as sharp as somebody who's 40? You know, because that's not what these other curves tell us should be happening, but yet plenty of people do. And there's even certain, what they call blue zones, where older adults live to a very late age, cognitively healthy too. So what is it that they're doing that's contributing to that? It's usually put back to a number of things. Their dietary patterns. So usually following kind of the diet that I showed you there. They're usually very socially connected communities as well. So often quite religious too, so they have that support from their religious community. But so what we wanted to do is to look at how these other health factors predict whether somebody's a super ager or not. We were kind of surprised that the only one that came out was hearing loss, and only in women as well. I was really surprised by that, because Our sample size wasn't huge, so maybe other things are going on there that we just didn't have the power to detect. Yeah. Well, we thought so too, but they didn't come out in the statistics except hearing loss. So hypertension didn't, substance abuse didn't, education didn't. Again, those might be influential in determining whether somebody's a superager or not. We just might not have had the statistical power to show that. But the one that came out loud and clear was hearing loss for women was more likely to make them not a superager. So women with good hearing were more likely to be superagers. Yes, it's a great term. Yeah, yeah.
Of course
yeah.
you did, Jen.
Yeah.
I think we have one more in the back. Is that right, Nedra? Yep. Okay.
Hello, yes, I'd like to find out what you think is going to be the next type of cognitive test going forward, in that the generations that are 30 now don't do addition in their head or subtraction.
Oh.
They can't read a regular clock.
That's true. That's
they
true.
don't draw a house, so they don't know how to draw a three-dimensional building.
Yeah.
What's going to happen?
That's a good question. I've thought about that too in terms of drawing a clock is standard on cognitive screens, and yeah, young adults don't know how to read a clock at all. I'm not sure, to be honest. Yeah, we'll have to get clever and think, what is it? I don't know, draw a TikTok comic strip or something, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, a modified phone, yeah.
I think we have time for a couple more. Dorothy?
And I've sneaked it in here. A lot of your variables, or when you're doing a statistical analysis, how independent are those variables? So
Oh,
there
that's
certainly
a
is covariance
very
with
good
a lot
point.
of them.
Yes, that Lancet Commission model, the lifestyle model, accounts for that. So they did population attributable risk accounting for the overlap. So for example, hypertension and obesity and diabetes, those tend to cluster together, but their percentage of each one contributing to global dementia prevalence accounts for that overlap. Yes, that's incredibly important to do that. And in our analysis with the cognicity data, we did it two ways. One, just how many risk factors do you have, which does not account for that overlap, and also weighting each one by the Lancet Commission's population attributable risk. We got the same answer both ways. So that's a very, very important point.
Yeah, I think we've had everyone's question answered. If there is someone who's going to ask something, let us know now. Or maybe you'll be back
Perfect.
tomorrow when we hear from Dr. Anderson about the results of our tests.
Yeah.
First of all, I can't thank you enough. This was fantastic. If there was ever a plug for Northumberland Learning Connection,
Yes.
this was it tonight. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
You've heard Dr. Anderson mention that tomorrow she'll be back here, so I think there's quite a few people who have registered for tomorrow. You can still do so tonight online. If you have time, please fill out the little piece of paper that was on your seat and put your pencil back in the box at the door. Thank you very much. Enjoy a coffee and a chocolate on your way out if you like, and thanks for coming. We'll see you tomorrow.